Good evening, everyone. Welcome especially to all of our members who are here. And as you can see, a discussion of the Jewish future and Yiddish is largely reserved for the happy few, as Stendhal would say. But that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're not just talking about language. We're talking about the Jewish future. And the Jewish future depends upon our understanding of our past, the role that Yiddish has played and will continue to play. And moreover, the role that the YIVO Institute will play in the furtherance of the study of Yiddish, teaching it to new generations, and not just teaching it, but truly developing the highest scholarly standards for the perpetuation of both academic and general knowledge of our language. The Yiddish language and the culture of East European Jews, the civilization that it came out of, is one of the great accomplishments of the Jewish people in its millennial history. It is an accomplishment that is almost unrivaled. I had a conversation not long ago with Leon Botstein, who has, of course, as many of you know, thought very hard and long about the subject of Jewish music. And he said, you know, when I think about German Jewish music, and I think about American Jewish music, and then when I think about East European Jewish music, I see a real difference. Because in East Europe, that music and that culture and that language was actually a discrete embodiment of a national idea. Whereas in Germany and in America, it's more incorporated into American culture and German culture. And at least in his view, this tremendous accomplishment has an almost unique place, not just in the history of the Jewish people, but in world history. And so we're here both to celebrate it, to talk about it, to begin a conversation that is going to absorb the energy of the YIVO Institute for many years to come. And we are extremely grateful to the Atran Foundation for making this possible. This past year, we've managed to secure 3 visiting professorships, 1 in history, 1 in literature, and now this Atran position in Yiddish language and linguistics. And we hope that this is going to be the beginning, not of a revival or renewal, but the beginning of a true deepening of the commitment of this institution to the most scholarly standards of excellence in the study and the perpetuation of the language, in whatever shape that language will take within the Jewish world. Rachmiel Peltz has an extraordinary place in this conversation because I think he may be the only person who actually unites molecular biology with Sholem Aleichem. And this is really quite wonderful. It also demonstrates something about this Jewish world. It demonstrates how far one can go outside of the Jewish world in general culture, and at the same time retain a steadfast and deep and not just private commitment to the bedrock of this civilization. And Professor Peltz is our first ATRAN visiting professor of Yiddish language and linguistics, and this is his inaugural lecture. His talk will be followed by a special discussion with Edward Portnoy, Adina Simmet, and Ronnie Perelis about the role of language in the Jewish future. Dr. Peltz has taught a class on Yiddish ethnography in YIVO's winter program on Ashkenazi civilization this past January. He's chaired a one-day seminar for advanced Yiddish students, and beginning this month has convened a new Max Weinreich Center Yiddish Research Colloquium at YIVO, where emerging Yiddish scholars present works in progress to peers and senior scholars. More than that, we are developing, with his help, with his resources, and with his energy, which seems endless and extraordinary to everybody who knows him, the foundation of a plan going forward on how to maintain this program, deepen it, and give it real direction ultimately toward a master's degree or a certificate program of some sort. In connection with tonight's lecture, I'd like to acknowledge all the YIVO members who are here this evening. I will not ask you to stand up, but without you, we have no institute. With you, we have a real community, and we're so grateful to all of you for your contributions, both financial and moral, and you know, as Woody Allen said, showing up is 90% of the game. So we are extremely grateful. One thing I'd like to mention is that we're looking for volunteers in our expanding archival programs, library programs, educational programs. Anyone who would like to volunteer, please see me or Leah Falk, who is here, and or Jessica, who is here. And we would be very, very happy to try to work something out. And now it is my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachmiel Peltz, who is professor of sociolinguistics, founding director of Judaic Studies at Drexel University, where he is an authority on the social history of Yiddish language and culture. As I mentioned, he's a molecular biologist with postdoctoral work at numerous institutions in cancer research, and so on and so forth. A long list of very distinguished accomplishments. And Yiddish Studies and Linguistics at Columbia was his second doctorate. And so without more ado, Rachmiel.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's nice to see so many people. I'm used to small crowds, and in Yiddish, I don't know if this is a big crowd or a small crowd. Yiddish, we say, was kleiner der Oilem al shener de Simcha. And certainly this is Zera Shena Simcha, and we're talking about standards tonight, so we're talking about quality. Whenever I speak at YIVO, I have to stop before I start. Das heißt, eher ich bon zu reden, muss ich sagen ein paar Wörter. It is incumbent upon me to acknowledge the education and the nurturing I received here. And that usually takes up half the talk. Even though I was a kind von die Schulen, I did not grow up knowing what YIVO was. We had our own Chrestomatius, the primers and anthologies, and we did not need to resort to Uriel Weinreich's College Yiddish. And those were the days before his dictionary appeared. As a teenager at the Yiddish Lehrer Seminar, I was invited to be a volunteer guide for the YIVO exhibition on the Warsaw Ghetto Aufstand. From then on, I knew that this was a special place, one that combined the culture I had been studying as a child from age 7 with the lives of my parents and grandparents. I understood the former much better than the latter, and it would take quite a while for me to grasp that indeed these were one and the same. Needless to say, in the next half century, I would have many roles in the building on 86th Street, and more recently here on 16th Street, right down the street from where I attended Mittelschule, in the headquarters of the Zionistischen Arbeiterverband. If you remember, 575 6th Avenue, which is a condo, but it's an important place. People used to go for medical care there. As a graduate student in Yiddish and general linguistics at Columbia, I simultaneously studied Jewish history and Yiddish literature in many courses at YIVO's Max Weinreich Center. My main teacher, mentor, colleague, and friend was Lucian Dobrzycki. Soll hab ma lichten Gan Eden. Although I edited working papers and bibliographies, organized research seminars, and was editor of the Ideas, since I also have to tell you about something else tonight, let me just say that without the attraction of studying at YIVO, I would not have pursued a second doctorate at a research university. And without the archivists and librarians, and I see tonight Marek Webb from Amora, and the European-born staff members such as Bolek Ellenbogen and Hannah Frischdorf, I wouldn't be as smart as I am. Thanks to the Atfern Foundation and Jonathan's invitation, I'm attempting during my present residence at YIVO, to set the groundwork for a new formal program of core graduate-level courses in Yiddish studies here at YIVO, to ensure that the scholarly generation to come will study with peers and multiple professors and mentors in Mamaloschen, also wie sie passt für jede Sprach und Kultur. YIVO is the only place where this can happen because it is an institution concerned that the Jewish people should have teachers and researchers, archivists and librarians, editors and writers, artists and musicians who will understand the intersection of the study of the American Jewish experience, Jewish life in Eastern Europe, and unser letzten Churban, the Holocaust, all tied together by Yiddish and all that it signifies. So why should I want to verdreh a cup tonight about linguistic standardization and standards in society in general? I will tell you my answer, my conclusion, that leaders who plan for the future of a group, of a people, of a nation, all care deeply about standards. Those who concern themselves with standards remain committed to the group, the commons, and not just the individual. And it is just this way, and has been this way, for the champions of Yiddish language planning. In each case, it was a story of passion for Yiddish plus something else. And the plus is the road to a secure Jewish identity, usually accompanied by a package of factors. And language is a glue because language is not sounds and letters, words and thoughts. Language walks and talks, krächzt and sings, just as the title of Zborowski and Herzog tell us that life is with people, so too is language with people. I will outline some of the proposals of the Yiddish language planners over the past 125 years and show how much they worried over the Jewish future and understood that the group had to share standards, hefkeres, an anarchic condition in which every individual follows her own spelling rules or stylistic aspects of speaking and writing, does not provide for a strong future for the group. Und it's zum Inyan. Standards are an agreed-upon, consensus-based way of doing things. Standards can be qualitative or quantitative or both. Quality is often defined by the conformance to standards. A standards development organization may be able to advance an accredited consensus process. On December 9th, some of you who are NPR listeners may have heard a morning edition radio program researched and narrated by Richard Harris that reported for more than 5 minutes on a misidentified cell line. Harris chronicled how a misidentified cell line, MDA435, isolated from a cancer cell from a patient, had been identified as a breast cancer cell line in 1976. However, about 15 years ago, using newly developed DNA tests, scientists were able to look carefully at these cells and, lo and behold, discovered that they weren't derived from a breast cancer cell at all, but the breast cancer cells had been crowded out and overtaken by skin cancer cells. Maybe 1,000 scientific papers on breast cancer metastasis had actually been based on studies of rogue skin cells. Indeed, the cell line was identified to be identical to a melanoma cell line. Papers and warnings published by scientists and journal editors since that time have not stopped the misuse of the cell line. Even today, papers come in putatively about breast cancer research, but actually reporting data on the melanoma line. What a waste for breast cancer research. 1,000 worthless studies. In fact, one survey reports that between 18 and 36% of all cell lines are contaminated. Shocking, given the million-dollar research projects, academic researchers will still go down the hall and borrow cells from colleagues rather than spend an additional $300 to purchase the cell line from a reliable, tested supplier. Think of what it means to know your source. Moreover, they will not go ahead for another $100 and verify the genetic makeup of the cell line. This issue was alarming enough to have Richard Harris the next day, December 10th, on Morning Edition, extrapolate on the resistance to using and observing biological standards. Scientists, time and again, overlook and skip simple tests that would verify their work. Harris interviewed Leonard Friedman, founding president of the Global Biological Standards Institute. Friedman pointed to how uncomfortable researchers are when it comes to discussing irreproducibility. Officials at the National Institutes of Health and editors at the widely referenced Nature journals all shared how surprisingly difficult it is to police the production of work according to accepted professional standards. And this is how the broadcast concluded, quote, "In an ideal world, scientists toss all of their unauthenticated cell lines into the trash and start from scratch. Friedman's nonprofit is trying to nudge scientists in that direction. But so far, there is not enough incentive for academic scientists to take that step. Go no, Gewiss." Why am I bothering you about standards for biomedical research? My talk is about societal standards, planning for the future of the society, of the commons, concern for the group, the collective, not just the individual well-being, about scholars who care more about serving Jewish needs than about the demands of their discipline or profession. But the framework is not the Mishigassen of Yiddish, but rather the seriousness of planning for a healthy future for society and probing to understand the modus operandi and motivations of the social planners, of the standardizers, and the recalcitrance and pushback of the commons, of the Kleine Menschelach, including the leading lights who might be threatened by these communal standards, which might contest the more individualistic guides of behavior that they follow or the rules of the non-Jewish academy that are not necessarily in the best interests of, in this case, the Jewish commons. In the case of Yiddish and in many other societal instances, the development, setting, and observance of standards are overseen by voluntary consensus standard-setting organizations. Timothy Simcoe, a professor at Boston University School of Management and a senior economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors, has analyzed the problem of managing shared technology platforms, which are often governed by standard-setting organizations. He sees a similarity in regulating the problem of over-exclusion in technology platforms with the way economists deal with the overconsumption of resources. Using standard-setting organizations as models, economists have developed certification agents, bargaining forums, collective licensing arrangements, and research and development consortia. Simcoe bases his analysis on the work of economics Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, who worked out the principles for common pool resource institutions. She included the following as necessary policies, procedures, and attitudes for the success of such self-organized governance systems: effective communication, internal trust, and reciprocity. In our contemporary society, we are not only focusing on biomedical standards, shared technology platforms, and exploitation of natural resources, but recent discussion of shared standards in educational programs and curricula as opposed to testing, or the search for a system for determining what constitutes rape on campus. In some cases, the endeavor to establish standards and their acceptance approaches the status of the law of the land, but in most instances, we are dealing with the attempt to reach acceptance of the decisions of collective self-governance. Thus, we can now turn to the Jewish condition at the beginning of the 20th century and the movements for nationale Autonomie, national autonomy for the Jews in Eastern Europe. Nathan, or Nosson Birnbaum, lived from 1864 till 1937. There is no other Jewish leader who searched for an answer to the precarious situation of European Jewry more diligently than Birnbaum. He was the foremost ideologue of Ashkenazic Jewry in its nationalistic manifestations at the turn of the 20th century. In Vienna, he planned the early stages of the Zionist movement before Herzl, and is credited with coining the term Zionism. He then helped organize the Jews as a minority in Eastern Europe by way of a focus on their Yiddish language and culture, co-organizing the first Yiddish language conference in Czernowitz-Bukowina in 1908, and directing the office after the conference in an attempt to implement the conference proposals. Finally, Birnbaum's tshuva, the turning toward religious observance during the World War I years, enabled him to provide leadership for the young Agudas Yisrael party, making use of his political savvy and ability to state clear programmatic objectives. Even at the end, Birnbaum tied factors together in his own way, unlike the rejection by much of Orthodoxy of settlement in Palestine. He envisaged a nationalism that depends on age-old religious observance within a complete cultural envelope in the land of Israel. Clearly, Birnbaum spent his whole life attempting to guide the Jewish people to negotiate its fate as a nation. Let us try to demonstrate how he envisaged a regulated Yiddish. The main focus in the studies of the Czernowitz Conference has been the discussion at the conference of whether to recognize and declare the status of Yiddish as a nationale Sprache, a national language, the topic that dominated the proceedings. The symbolic strength of this conflict and the public outspoken advocacy of the prestige of Yiddish on the part of many delegates lingers on to this day. However, this emphasis has largely overshadowed any serious examination of other issues. Chief among these other matters were the calls for practical work on language standardization and language planning. Birnbaum, the major architect of the conference, and the leader of the short-lived organization after the conference, emphasized in his written recollections, written for YIVO's planned volume 20 years after the conference, that at the meeting he repeatedly underscored the necessity for sachliche Auftun, concrete achievements, rather than declarations relating to a national language. In the invitation to the conference, sent out to individuals and editorial boards of newspapers, the organizing committee complained of the lack of order in Yiddish spelling. Und schreiben schreibt jeder aufeinander Häufchen miteinander auslegerts, wo ma jiddische Orthographie, was soll gelten vor allem, ist noch nicht beschaffen. Everyone writes in their own style with their own spelling, because a Yiddish orthography that would hold for everyone has not yet been created. The committee pleaded for the creation of regulations and rules for the language as though they did not exist naturally. Bedarf man beschaffen an min Zäum und Geder, an min Abhittung von unser Zeiren Mamaloschen, soll nicht herumlaufen, so wild wie besitzt, nicht wären a heftiger Sach, nicht wären zerrissen und zerteilt. Therefore, we need to create a kind of bridle and restraint, a watchdog for our mother tongue, to see that it should not run around so wild as heretofore, not become chaotic, torn apart, and divided up. The organizers call for everyone to confer and to find the proper means to establish an Autorität, welche alle sollen müssen und wollen sich untergeben, an authority which all will be obliged to and will willingly obey. 10 items were on the agenda included in the invitation, the first 4 of which related to Yiddish standardization. 1, Yiddish orthography, 2, Yiddish grammar, 3, foreign and new words, and 4, a Yiddish dictionary. I would like to highlight the primary goals of the conferences dealing with Yiddish corpus planning. Reports of the proceedings described several sessions on 4 days that discussed the above 4 standardization issues. A Yiddish language academy was foreseen that would deliberate and arbitrate and decree to those working with Yiddish language within cultural organizations. We must remember that although Birnbaum was a language architect, he was part of a group of delegates, but also a group of language planners. And at that time, there was a tzibur, or natural collective. Today, we would call it a Yiddish speech community that cared about Sprachkultur, language cultivation. I would argue that Birnbaum as architect and the Chanovitz Language Conference set the stage for collective Yiddish language planning between 1908 and 1941. The agenda of Chanovitz became the goal of collective Yiddish language planning between the wars at YIVO and at the larger and more active Yiddish research institutes in Kiev and Minsk. This was the success of Chanovitz. And we must remember that Birnbaum was one of a team of planners worrying about a collective that used the language, even if it was not necessarily ideologically bound to it. The contribution of Nosson Birnbaum to planning for a healthy Jewish future is unequaled. This has been documented for us by Schickel Fishman's many articles and book on Birnbaum and language, as well as by Jess Olson's more recent dissertation and book on all of Birnbaum's writings. I am still awaiting a study of the Birnbaum family dynamics that might shed light on the transmission of Yiddishkeit from one generation to the next, that could account for the fact that this Baal Tshuva of a century ago has today great-great-grandchildren who remain religiously observant. Moreover, for my thesis that language advocacy is paired with involvement in the struggle for a secure Jewish future, I would want to understand the relationship of Birnbaum to his son Solomon, or Shlomo, the renowned paleographer, Yiddish grammarian, and first professor of Yiddish in Europe. In addition, the recently deceased Jacob Birnbaum, the eldest grandson, would have known his grandfather the best. I would want to know about Birnbaum's influence on Jacob, the Columbus of the most successful activist movement internal to the Jewish people, the founder in 1964 of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. And I was there in 1964, the first demonstrations of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, the same year that Jugendhof was formed in the YIVO building in August of '64. The study of the societal endeavor of language planning has divided the work twofold. On the one hand, there is the building of the content and structure of the language itself, corpus planning, seen most often in the regulation of spelling and the nature of the lexicon, including the formation of new words. Such was the case for the work with Yiddish. Attempts at standardizing syntax and pronunciation, for example, are far rarer. On the other hand, the planners attempt to introduce new functions for the language within the society and culture. This other kind of planning is termed status planning by the analysts of the sociology of language. Usually, governments decide which language is used for which purpose. In the case of the Imperia Yiddish, to use Roebuck's metaphor, without a government, without an army, Jewish society was subject to the natural, age-old processes of standardization that groups of people evolve in order to be understood and to transmit culture from one generation to the next, submitting to the pressures of prestige, recognized as such because of varying social factors. The historic Chernovitz conference led by Birnbaum approached the ultimate status planning issue of that forum, number 10 on the agenda, the famous recognition of Yiddish as the or a national language. But subsequent years of status planning for Yiddish would see its introduction into high school chemistry labs in Vilna and metallurgy factories and administrative legal courts in the Soviet Union, for example. Birnbaum was continually determining the pulse of the Jewish nation and ministering to its collective needs. His reach was always larger than settlement in a Jewish territory, or the Yiddish language, or Jewish faith. His younger contemporary, Ber Borchov, advocated for the former two imperatives, positions that would keep the Jews together in a hostile world. Born in Zolotonozhne in Ukraine in 1881, Borchov died in Kiev in 1917 at age 36, after spending the war years in America and returning to Russia to serve Jewish needs after the First Revolution, given what was then recognized as new, attractive prospects for minority rights. Birnbaum, a German speaker, although exposed to Yiddish as a child at home in Vienna, had to learn how to speak Yiddish and held his address in a Yiddish that was the subject of derision and ridicule at the Chernovitz conference. Borchov, in contrast, was a Russian speaker who had to learn to both speak and write in Yiddish, although it probably was his first language before his parents started to speak to him in Russian at age 2. But you learn a lot before age 2. Just remember that. Both were converted to the cause of Yiddish, not by theoretical argumentation, but through the practical, everyday exposure, everyday experience with Yidden von a ganz Jahr, the poor Horapashne Jews with whom they came into contact in their local excursions. Their conversions may have been romanticized and idealized, but they were driven by their attraction to the ordinary Jews of the Shtetlach. For Birnbaum, that did not occur until he was running for office and campaigning amongst the Jews in Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1907. For Borchov, while on tour in Der Litte for the General Zionists led by Ussishkin in 1904, he started speaking more Yiddish and writing to his parents in Yiddish. In 1905, he wrote to Ussishkin, "Es ist klar, als red nit jargon schlecht." It's clear that I speak jargon, not badly. In Bialystok, he spoke to the intelligentsia in Russian and the workers in Yiddish. But this is not simply a tool of communication he is using to propagandize the workers. Borchov is learning about Yiddishkeit. In his wife Lyuba's memoirs, we read that he came home miushar lelo ketz, happy without a limit. She contrasts his experience in growing up in Russified Poltava, where he did not experience the gam lo et haruach hadat das pintele yid, and also not the spirit, the faith, the essence of Yiddishkeit. In 1907-1908, his translator, Rubashov Shazar, and his editor, Vitkin Zerubbabel, report that his first political articles arrived at the editorial offices written in Yiddish. Borchov was a radical theoretician who harmonized Marxist materialist theory of the class struggle with socialist Zionism. His theoretical formulation served as the basis for a new socialist Zionist party, Poyelitzian in Russia, of which he was co-founder and predominant leader, starting in the period November 1905 through March 1906. Borchov remained a strong advocate throughout his life of Jewish settlement in Palestine, which he described as a stichik, self-driven process. It is not by chance that his first article, written entirely in Yiddish in 1908, was on the nationality question in Belgium, with a focus on language and culture. Although Borchov explained to his local colleagues that he had come to Belgium only to study the problem of dual nationality as a basis for understanding Jews and Arabs in Palestine, what emerged was a sociolinguistic study and a change in lifestyle. According to Lyuba, the stay in Belgium inaugurated Borchov's serious research work and study, what she called life in the office. For Yiddish, this meant the fundamental establishment of Yiddish philology, which included Borchov's foundational work on the pedigree of historical Yiddish texts, the identification of critical sources, the analysis of the history and structure of the language, as well as the determination of how the language had been studied, in addition to the plan for the history of Yiddish literature. Borchov did everything. But Borchov and every philolog at the time was also a language and cultural planner, a designer of regulatory and standardizing institutions. In his short life, Borchov remained the Zionist leader who saw settlement in Palestine as the ultimate resolution of the Jewish condition in Eastern Europe. But from close perusal of the evidence that remains, most of his energies for the next 10 years are poured into the prodigious research on Yiddish in order for European Jews to be able to cultivate their control over their own language, identity, and destiny. The role of the philolog, according to Borchov, is to help the nation to gain a command of its language. Obviously, the people have evolved their spoken use of the language over centuries without the help of such national leaders. But now Borchov and others are advocating an educational program. To quote, "Die erste Sach für jeden aufwachendigen Volk ist während Haar über sein eigener Sprach. Kedei, was besser, was breiter, was produktiver sie ausnutzen in einem nationalen Schaffen." The first thing for every awakening people is to become a master of one's own language in order to better, more broadly, and productively apply it in national creativity. And to quote, "Früher darf man das Volk auslernen, schreiben richtig. Der noch herrscht, wird sich kennenlernen, zu schreiben schein." First, the people have to be taught to write correctly. Only then will they be able to learn to create belles lettres. Borchov, the defender of the Jewish proletariat, now defends the language Yiddish. Not only should Yiddish be respected, but it should be written correctly according to standardized rules starting from a phonetic basis. Again, he appeals to his exhortation to the speech of the folk. Schreib wie du redst. Write as you speak. Borchov, oft depicted by his followers as a Superman-like figure, himself did not have the confidence that his philological goals could be achieved by one individual. The service to the commons could only be effected by a collective of standardizers, who themselves are also researchers and teachers. As early as 1913, he called for a central national academy that would deal with all philological matters and whose authority would be accepted and essential for the success of any normative work. He recommended not only language standardization by a Jewish academy, but also a broader proposal for centralized Jewish research by Jews in a Jewish language. Now we see the groundwork being laid for the work of the standardizing Jewish research institutes founded between the wars. The Yiddish section of the Institute for Belarusian Culture in Weisskult in Minsk, the Jewish cultural branch of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in Kiev, and YIVO, the Jewish Research Institute in Vilna. Borchov distinguishes between Yiddish linguistics and Yiddish philology, and clearly identifies with the latter. In one letter to Shmuel Nigel, Borchov limits the study of philology to scientific grammar and folklore research. But in a later work, he breaks down his chosen discipline to grammar, language history, word construction, dialects, literature and literary history, folklore, archaeology, folk traditions, customs, and moral and art history. By the end of his life, Borchov's research and writing did indeed approach the broader definition of philology. Now we are faced with confronting the question of cultural transmission through organized education. Earlier, we considered the expansion of societal niches for Yiddish, and now we question the standards for what constitutes Yiddish. In a world that does not necessarily guarantee cultural transmission within the family and tribe, what becomes the role of the standardizing agency, and what does that academy research and teach? The separation of research and advocacy did not exist for Borchov. He construed philology as requiring a faith in the language. Für ein Philolog ist no möglich, als sein Objekt lebt und wird leben. The only approach for a philolog that is possible is that his research object lives and will live. Although Borchov's major contribution was in research and writing, he also supported more practical work. Borchov gave two examples of what he referred to as his own values. The collective anthology of Yiddish philological research, Del Pincus, edited by Nigel, and, to quote him, Dr. Birnbaum's activity and ideological struggle. He tried to solicit financial aid for Nosson Birnbaum's private needs in order to enable him to continue his organization of a Yiddish cultural movement. After his death, his Zionist followers in Poilitzian in Kiev erected a matzeva unveiled on December 17th, 1918, in honor of the Yotzeit. On one of the surfaces reads the inscriptions, hat ausgelernt sein Volk schreiben, and die erste Sach für jeden aufwachendigen Volk ist wären a Haar über sein eigener Sprach. The other two sides describe political Borchovism, their brand of communism and socialist Jewish culture and society in Palestine. Now that's Yiddish plus. Uriel Weinreich was born in Vilna in 1926 and died in New York in 1967 at age 40. Although I did not know Weinreich, I feel connected in a special way. I believe I am the only one who studied with his two most outstanding students. Firstly, Michal Herzog, his successor at Columbia and director of the Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry, as well as dean of YIVO's Max Weinreich Center and longtime YIVO board member. In addition, I spent a year of graduate study with Bill Labov, University of Pennsylvania linguistics professor, founder of the field of sociolinguistics in America, and early expert on African American vernacular. I found one similarity in these two Weinreich students. Both held an almost adulatory relationship toward Weinreich. Labov now in his upper 80s and very research active, and one of the world's most productive linguists, continues to declare that he still finds that all of his ideas had root in Weinreich's formulations. Moreover, Herzog, who by dint of his deep and long analysis of the data of Yiddish linguistic geography became the expert in the field, never put forward his examination as original, but time and again gave credit to the insights of Weinreich. Having worked with Weinreich's archives here at YIVO, and after trying to understand his life and work, I can well appreciate the overwhelming nature of his contributions. And it is hard to believe that Yiddish represents only part of his oeuvre. For the purposes of our present discussion, it is clear that at a very young age, in 1949, Weinreich had completed a grammar, he was only 23, college Yiddish, and a dictionary, which would not be published until 1968. Both are two major gatekeepers of language standardization. Obviously, Weinreich had thought these were needed projects for Yiddish in America. And we will demonstrate that both he and Mordechai Schachter, having experienced enough of a life before the war's outbreak and subsequent Churban, were in a special position to provide continuity for Yiddish language and culture in America. In the beginning years, while attending George Washington High School, and he graduated as salutatorian, I would want to meet that valedictorian, and his time at the Shalom Aleichem Mittelschule, Weinreich wrote that he intended to return to Vilna as soon as the war was over. Weinreich was a strong advocate of YIVO's system of standardized orthography, but both he and Schachter were language planners without any sizable cadre of colleagues, their contemporary planners, and without a welcoming or even resistant SIBA or commons for which to practice the various stages of status or corpus planning. But one of the areas upon which we dwelled in the case of Borchov is very relevant to the work of Weinreich. I will attempt to understand Weinreich's conception of the field of Yiddish, especially in terms of the standards he erected for the areas in which a young scholar was to obtain advanced training. By the time Uriel Weinreich was forming his program in the 1950s, the nationalistic goals of East European Jews were not on the agenda, not the political nor the academic, after the destruction of most of these Jews and the repression of the Jews in the Soviet Union. Weinreich was fitting Yiddish studies into the disciplines of most languages and cultures taught within humanities departments in the United States. The base was language and literature. Folklore, if present, represented additional literary genres, not an ethnographically process-related field, such as the contemporary one. I am contrasting this narrower view of philology in Borchov's terms, the mainstay of Weinreich's program, namely language, literature, and folklore, with the wider views of Yiddish studies, the broader definition of culture in Borchov's view, which fits the integrated research program of the interwar institutes, and, I suggest, the current needs of the field. When I refer to current needs, I'm addressing the needs of the Jewish people to educate its future generations, and specifically with regard to its Jewish languages and cultures. Culture encompasses the behavior of a people, of an ethnic group, that is transmitted by practices innate to the society, starting within the family. The lessons that are taught, the values that are advocated, represent the priorities of the people themselves. These then have to become the priorities of the researcher. My claim, and Borchov's, is that the task of the philolog is to blur the lines between the humanities and the social sciences. The field of Yiddish of tomorrow would thus be open to the interests of anthropologists, sociologists, social psychologists, inter- and intra-group communication researchers, social and cultural historians, musicologists, art historians, and narrative researchers. The tripartite mainstay which Weinreich strengthened no longer exists, Academic departments devoted to language and culture area studies have in recent decades become the exclusive domain of literary critics and researchers, without the presence of linguists and folklorists. Indeed, it is easier to deal with a culture that can be defined between the covers of books, rather than the dynamic parameters of social interactions and rituals in the past, present, and future. I want to return to Uriel Weinreich. I was not criticizing the way in which he carved out the standards for an academic field in the American University of 1952, or in any way accusing him of narrow provincialism. His insights into the workings of cultures are the most sophisticated within the field of Yiddish. In 1949, he wrote, "The East European environment in which I spent the early part of my life served to impress upon me that language is much more than a logical sound system, intertwined as it is with social and cultural problems of a most complex nature." Inspired by the breadth of Uriel Weinreich's grasp of East European Jewish culture, I plan to broaden the content of graduate courses in Yiddish culture in establishing new standards for a new program of graduate Yiddish studies at YIVO. Uriel Weinreich is the only Yiddish standardizer whom I chose to present that was not devoted to an area in the politics of the Jewish future. This criterion for involvement in language standardization might not apply to all life situations, especially those relating to uprooting, as experienced by the Weinreich family, and in general for the survivors of genocide. If a language planner is asking the survivors of genocide to engage intimately with the language and culture that suffered so tremendously, it is no wonder that there is indifference and pushback. Quite a different consideration from those I presented at the beginning of my talk, in which we looked at the occurrence of resistance to observing shared standards. I have searched for evidence after different genocides of attempts at teaching about the culture and the way of life that was decimated. It seems easier to teach about the process of destruction itself rather than to look carefully at the loss, be it in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, or Unser letzten Churben, the Holocaust. In my first year at the Yiddish Lecha Seminar, Jewish Teachers Seminary, I received a textbook for the freshman Yiddish language course. It was Der Orthographische Wegweiser, Guide to Yiddish Orthography, 1961, by Mordechai Schechter and Max Weinreich. The main part of this course textbook was an alphabetically arranged dictionary of examples of words and phrases in their proper spelling that illustrated specific properties of the system of standardized orthography that had been ratified and accepted by YIVO and CISHO, the Zentrale Jiddische Schulorganisatie, Central Organization of Yiddish Schools in Poland, in 1936. The Wegweiser was brand new, and it was supplied to us by our course instructor, Assistant Professor Mordechai Schechter. As a boy, I had studied Yiddish for 9 years in the supplementary school and high school of the Shalom Aleichem Folk Institute and the Verband Labor Zionist Alliance. I had heard nothing specific about standardized orthography. We never had a dictionary and did not think about checking spelling. As we used to do for English words in public school. We wrote the sound A with 2 dots under the double yud letter combination. No one had made a big deal about spelling. What was happening here in Dr. Schechter's class? Who would or should care about such rules? Well, some 30 years later, I was teaching those same rules in the advanced Yiddish language classes to graduate and undergraduate students at Columbia University. Mordechai Schechter was born in 1927 in Czernowitz, Bukowina, and died in 2007 in New York City. Like Weinreich, he grew up before World War II when there was a vibrant Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Coming to America after completing his doctorate in linguistics at the University of Vienna after the war, he found a very different kind of Jewish collective. What constitutes the Tzibur, the collective for Sprachkultur, for language cultivation? In 1934-36, when these YIVO Tisho rules were first codified, there were the researchers at YIVO and the Yiddish students in the schools of the Jewish Socialist Bund and the left Poilitzian, labor Zionist parties. In the 1960s, other than the few Lehre seminar students, like myself, some 80 interested individuals called by Schechter die Smetana von der Dämmerliche Yiddish Intelligenz in New York, the cream of the Yiddish intelligentsia of New York of the day, signed up for a course at YIVO, right? This is 80 people, and that's an island, to study the rules of standardized orthography. In those years, there were organizations whose secretaries still conducted business in Yiddish. I remember a room full of Yiddish typewriters in the Lehre seminar, with some courses in Yiddish typing and shorthand. But the tzibur was changing, and we must ask ourselves if indeed there was a significant collective effort involved at any stage of Yiddish language planning. The collective dimension of the work was certainly present in Chernovitz in 1908. However, when a younger person studies Yiddish and learns the spelling rules, it's a good feeling to know that the language has spelling conventions, just like in English. This breeds an attitude of respect toward the language. The rules did not have to make sense. For example, it did not bother me that the consonants that take a dot in the middle have corresponding forms that take a rofe or small line over the consonant, except for the letter chof. And the bays doesn't take a dot, and the sof doesn't take a rofe. This asymmetry was simply a fact of spelling. Schechter was not only concerned with spelling, but also with enriching the language. His greatest pleasure was to be accused of introducing an unnecessary neologism, only to be able to identify the new word as having been used in a text of the 18th century. I was able to help Schechter prepare his volume of discussions of his prescriptive recommendations, Leitish Mama Loshen, the proper mother tongue, published in 1986. What made this especially good and informative reading was that it taught all aspects of the language and its history. I had to convince Schechter that he was not only teaching prescriptivism, but also language history, stylistics, dialectology, and pragmatics. Schechter was the most knowledgeable authority on Yiddish structure variation and history at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. The literary spoken language was closest to the pronunciation of the northeastern Yiddish dialect. Schechter was also a champion of the maintenance of the dialects. We learned how to speak the correct standard. From Schechter. But what a shock for his students when, as an act of advocating for the dialects, Schechter in the late 80s, on one occasion, held a Yiddish talk at YIVO in his own Bukowina dialect. There was yet another standard that Schechter maintained regarding the language of conversation. As an incentive to speak Yiddish, Schechter would always speak Yiddish to anyone and everyone who could understand Yiddish. This was an incentive for the learner, who then would spread her circle of Yiddish speakers. A unique study would apply if one surveyed the effect of speaking Yiddish to those who understand, which surely leads to initiating chains of Yiddish conversation with new interlocutors. Mordechai Schechter's commitment to Yiddish language standards was coupled to his commitment to the Freeland League and its editor, I.N. Yud Nachman Steinberg, the famed socialist revolutionary in Russia. Schechter became loyal to the ideals of the territorialist while he was in the Vienna displaced persons camp before coming to America. Dr. Steinberg worked frantically in the years before World War II to find an unsettled area in the world that would be hospitable to the Jews. Sadly, he was unable to find a haven for Europe's Jews before Hitler killed them. And even for a few years after the establishment of the State of Israel, he attempted to establish Jewish settlement in Australia. Schechter, a few years later, was looking toward the prospect of establishing small colonies in New Jersey, for example, in which people could live together and share Yiddish language and culture. Thus, he was an advocate of standards for Yiddish and the formation of compact communities of Yiddish-speaking Jews. In a world devoted to the power of individual creativity, it is of significance to note that ideals and the work of those dedicated to the needs of the group and of the commons, hand in hand with advocacy for standards for language and culture, I tried to identify the struggle for a strong group identity for Jews as a minority in different societies. I chose 4 Yiddish language planners, but could have picked scores of others, such as the folkist Yudel Mark, an authority on Yiddish grammar, who edited for years YIVO's prescriptive journal, Yiddische Sprach. Or Elia Spivak, the terminology standardizer in the Soviet Union, who from 1934 until murdered by Stalin in 1952, fiercely defended the traditional components of Yiddish. Or the philolog Mordechai Wenger in Minsk, who documented geographic and social variation in the language. Or Nachum Stiff, the supreme stylist of the language, who launched the idea of the Yiddish Academy we now call YIVO, but was subjected to political pressures in communist Kiev that resulted in his early death in 1933. As Uriel Weinreich pointed out, let no one think that the coining of a new word or the prescription of an old one, a change in spelling or the conversion of a language to a different script are trivial or painless matters. Bourdieu argued that when a language is recognized, its speakers are empowered. The conscious standardization process supported by luminaries such as Birnbaum, Borcha, Weinreich, and Schechter helps a speaker relate to her language with pride, be it heritage language learned in the family or in the classroom. After Dem letzten Churban, the Holocaust, the Jewish people need to be retaught their language and culture. Diversity supports creativity. Lingua franca, be it English or Hebrew, cannot alone support Jewish life in its fulfillment. Jews need Jewish languages. Jews need Yiddish. The move towards standards balanced by measured diversity builds a stronger biomedical research enterprise and a stronger Jewish society. Now, before we move on to the next stage, we were going to look at the photograph that some of you got a chance to look at and show that the movement for standards has to be understood within the context of the times, of the time in history. So we're going to now look at a photograph from April 1970, and those older members in the audience who were around then, I don't know what you think of when you think April 1970, but I was writing my dissertation and living in Philadelphia then. I have to go back to that. Whoops. And in April 1970, I came to New York because it was the first Earth Day. If you remember the first Earth Day, right? This was big post-Rachel Carson ecology movement. So now, I don't know how to use this, but I assume this is. Maybe you'll just show me how to. I'm going to point out some of the luminaries, some of whom are in this room today. So, de Mordche Schechter soll haben a lichtigen Gan Eden. My wife, Dr. Chana Klieger, then a senior in high school. Yours truly. Now, some of my mother, Yiddish, her native language, born in Biala Podlask, came here at age 8. David Leza Gold. Yiddish researchers have advocated for Jewish languages in general and have taken up the study of many Jewish languages. David Leza Gold, Yitzhalangiyo, was a professor at the University of Haifa and the editor and founder of the Journal of Jewish Languages and an expert on Judeo-Spanish. Label Khan, a close confederate of Dr. Schechter, who wrote about the history of Yiddish language planning, and the younger Fishman, brother of Davidel Fishman, Avramel Fishman, Meir Lenis from Malden, a reader of Tomorrow. Adel Schechter Resnick, now a resident of Tzfas and formerly of Enga Benga. Benjamin Schechter, the Jewish Philharmonic Choir director, who was in the audience with his famous sign, Ich Euch. But maybe you can help me later on identify some of the people. I want to know who this young woman is, because what she said was, reine Luft, reine Wasserin, reine Sprach. That it's not just about purity, it's about beauty, and it's all together. For those of us who care about our environment and its quality, we also care about our language, and we want to use the same standards. And this was what we were doing when we were celebrating our own kind of Earth Day on East Broadway, picketing the Yiddish newspapers so that they should standardize their orthography and modernize their content, as they did to a certain extent, and it took many, many years. Only one of them at that point, there was a lot of pushback, would negotiate with us. That was Jacobson, who was the then publisher of the Tug Morgen Journal, and by the following December, the whole outfit closed down. The others threw eggs and resisted and didn't want to take part in the standards. So we are now ready for the second part, and I'm glad. I'm glad to be able to share this part with three of my friends, and I'll ask them to come up. Doctors Eddie Portnoy, Adina Simmet, and Ronnie Perilous, who have devoted so much of their lives in very special ways to the Jewish future and the future of Jewish languages.
Thank you, Rachmiel. That was an interesting look at how language planning and standards are so integral to cultural maintenance. Okay, as part of our panel tonight, we have Ronnie Perilous. He's the Chief Rabbi, Dr. Abraham and Yelena Alkalai Chair and Assistant Professor of Sephardic Studies at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies of Yeshiva University. His research explores the connections between Iberian and Jewish culture during the medieval and early modern periods. His doctoral thesis, Marano Autobiography and its Transatlantic Context, Exile, Exploration, and Spiritual Discovery, in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at NYU, studies three autobiographical texts written by crypto-Jews whose religious trajectories unfolded within the early modern Atlantic world. Dr. Perilous contributed the chapter Conversos en las Américas to a new textbook for Sephardic studies, Los Estudios Sefarditas para Estudiantes de Español. His essays on Sephardic history investigate the dynamics of religious transformation within the context of the crypto-Jewish experience. He's currently writing a study of family and identity in the Sephardic Atlantic world. We also have Dr. Adina Tzimmet. She's born in Mexico City, studied sociology at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, after which she completed a PhD in sociology at Columbia University. Subsequent to that, she taught contemporary civilization at Columbia for a number of years, and also taught for 10 years in YIVO's summer Yiddish program. In addition, she was the director of EPIC, the education program on Yiddish culture, an extensive course in Yiddish civilization, as well as the website When These Streets Spoke Yiddish. It's truly excellent. I suggest you look at that. More recently, Dr. Tzimmet directed the production of a new animated series for Yiddish language learning called Yiddish Pop. It's available at yiddishpop.com, also very interesting. She's the author of dozens of articles on sociological matters, minority life, education, and language, and 2 books, Jewish Lublin, a cultural monograph, and Ashkenazi Jews in Mexico, Ideologies and the Structuring of a Community, which is part of SUNY's series in Judaic Studies. I am Eddie Portnoy. I'm YIVO's academic advisor, and I teach in the Judaic Studies program at Rutgers University. My specialties are Yiddish popular culture. Okay, let's begin. You are going to go first with your, okay.
It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. And I come at this from a very different linguistic, geographic point of view, and also time period point of view. My focus is more on the early modern period, much less so on the modern period and with all its changing complexities. But in many ways, the early modern period, at least in the Sephardic context, can sometimes provide us with certain models and ways of thinking about the relationship between language, culture, and identity, especially in a world in motion, where cultures and societies are changing because of turmoil, because of uprooting, because of exile, because of cultural and economic opportunities, which sounds a lot like the modern world that we're familiar with some important differences. And I'll just say, that the Jews in Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula to be more exact, spoke the language of the streets. They didn't speak a specific Jewish language. But they wrote a specific Jewish language. In other words, they would, first of all, the cultivation of Hebrew is obviously very, very important going back to early medieval period, alongside the importance of Arabic and Judeo-Arabic. But the writing down of Castilian or Catalan or Portuguese in Hebrew characters was an important part of Iberian Jewish culture. We have everything from letters and personal correspondence to great works of philosophy and literature being written down in the vernacular, in Hebrew characters, and for the very elites who were very much involved with the royal courts and whatnot, writing the language of the land in Latin characters as well. When the exile happens and Jews go into the Mediterranean, they enter, particularly in the Ottoman Empire, we know that that's when what we would call Ladino or Judesmo or Judeo-Spanish really develops its real characteristics, very similar to Yiddish, right? Where you have a situation where surrounded by people who don't speak your language, but you maintain this language as part of your identity and who you are internally and externally. The maintenance of Spanish, which turned into a specific sort of Spanish in exile, was the glue that kept the Jews within their community together and which connected them to other Jews throughout the Mediterranean world, other Jews who also maintained Spanish as a living commercial language, personal language. But we have a very different situation when we think of the Jews in Western Europe, the Jews who leave from Portugal in particular as conversos, as people who were fully enwrapped in Catholic life, and they start a new Jewish life in Amsterdam and then the wider diaspora. The Jewish language that they maintain is not in Hebrew characters, but it's actually the language of their, you could say, their former oppressors. It's the language of Spanish and Portuguese. And that's the language that their chachamim use in the synagogue for their sermons. That's the language that the great writers like Menashe ben Israel and Avram Pereira will be using in their publishing houses. In Latin characters, in terms of standards, fully following the standards that were current in the peninsula, because although they leave the peninsula to avoid persecution, they maintain themselves deeply connected culturally and commercially with the goings-on of the wider Iberian world from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas. And for 200 years, Sidurim are being published in Spanish, not in Hebrew characters, and in Latin characters. And within this Western Sephardic diaspora, these people, for the most part, live not among Spanish speakers. This becomes a Jewish language. It maintains itself as a Jewish language, despite the fact that it doesn't look like what the Jewish language would look in let's say, the Ottoman Empire. And it's a really interesting model to think about how do you maintain identity and the importance of language for that identity, eventually with the greater acceptance of the Western world and emancipation and citizenship. Those languages do lose their hold on those communities, only remaining in certain terms and certain phrases that are maintained. And the question really of how do you maintain, know how important language is, and yet there are greater forces at play, and how do you maintain that connection to the past tradition and developed literature in a world where people no longer speak that language because they've become assimilated into Dutch or English or American society. And how does that work? And that's so your talk sets the standard very high, literally, and challenges us to think about it. And it's useful to look at other historical moments and cultural moments where language was obviously so important, and yet really faces such severe challenges. So thank you.
Hi. Again, thank you all for the invitation to be here with you. Let me try to make a few comments on your talk from the perspective of a wider sociological lens that I often use myself in my work. You are talking and signal to identify to us a whole group, let's say, of people that in their particular field of linguistics and language knowledge were erudites and unique and gave a contribution to the culture of the language in the last 120 years, as you spoke. But behind it, behind that description, what we know we're talking about, because today it's 2015 and we're still talking about the need for all of that, I think what we're talking about is the difficulty for continuity of the language and the culture. And that's the very, very difficult issue that we face, that pains us all, and that I think we can't ignore. Despite of how we analyze one and each one of these personalities that you described, whether there is no doubt that one needs to recognize their extraordinary contributions, but one can agree or disagree politically on what they did specifically. I think that we are facing issues of continuity that are in crisis. It is interesting that we are an audience and we are at a place where this theme is accepted and heard sympathetically. The last 20 years, internationally, I think, one can say that issues of human and civil rights, individually and collectively, have been recognized in different ways. The UN has, in the 90s, for instance, prepared accords that protect minority languages or linguistic rights, and we are conscious of these new achievements internationally, politically. But we are a people that suffered in the 20th century inordinately in our culture and languages, and we suffered in a way that we have ripple effects still today. it hasn't finished with the war itself. And it's silly to think that done and over, we are just memorializing Holocaust and Shoah every year. In fact, what we are and what we need to do is that we are facing the problems still today. We're facing the demise of our language use and the demise of our culture as it is attached to the people of our communities and our, all over the world. And so for that, I would like to say that Yiddish qualifies, unfortunately, into a group of languages that are called endangered languages. And I know that specifically speaking, it's not so. We have the Hasidim, communities of Hasidim that use the language in their own way, to their own purposes, and therefore the numbers that back the usage of the language are different from communities that have 2,000 speakers or 70 speakers, depending on the language. And we can go statistically to review language problems. We know that we have recognized in the world today are between 6,000 to 7,000 languages, more or less, of which we also know that in the next 100 years, half of them will disappear. We know that we have, for instance, 800 Amerindian languages, indigenous Amerindian languages, of which more than 50% has disappeared already. And we know, and we again are an audience that feel that when we talk about these things, that the disappearance of a language is horrendous for the level of consciousness of the world. So that when we need to talk about our Yiddish and Yiddish culture, 1,000-year-old culture, about how we do standardization, how do we have institutions that will support that sort of effort. People, we are facing a crisis, in my opinion. There is an inaction at the level of governments often, governments that tend to, in the modern and better way, go for offering negative rights, meaning I let you live your life, you can be tolerated with your own subculture in my society, but I'm not giving you any positive rights. I will not provide you with money, I will not provide you with the outside environment in which you can use it, and so on and so forth. So negative rights is what usually are the concessions to the 250 governments, and not all of them, as we know that when they are good, they are tolerating other languages, other minority languages. So, our Jews in America, for instance, or Latin America, where I come from in Mexico, we are immigrant Jews that have done everything in the world not to become and stay disenfranchised. We want to be connected, we want to be part of the ongoings of society, and the price that gets paid, and this is a very complex issue, and I'm just touching it briefly, is that there is a detachment from one's own sources and culture. We have to face the fact that we don't have today massive groups of children speaking the language. There are always exceptions, I'm not talking about that, but massively, generally, we don't have it. We don't have the next generation. We don't have users of the language, of the rich language that Yiddish is and its culture, the way we should have it. We have partial users, I'm inventing a term if you want, that talks about a usage at a very low common denominator. We have talked about in the world after the Holocaust, we have our motto, never again. We are conscious that we have to fight, and we have been fighting for physical survival, whether it's Israel, whether it's in diaspora as communities with our culture. But I ask myself, and I ask you, why the reversing of the language shift that we are feeling and seeing and experiencing is not fought sufficiently institutionally within our Jewish communities. We have to understand that if we fight for it, we are recognizing constantly that we were wronged in the past century and that we are trying to put the status right. If we leave the situation with inertia, if we leave it for the very few that are training themselves to be professors, to be knowledgeable in their particular fields, without institutional support, and there are many institutions I'm referring to that need to support this effort if we are to see a change, then we are going to see a language and a culture in natural decline, and I'm not predicting anything specifically because I don't know the future, but this is what we are seeing in our own lifetime. We will be looking at a gorgeous sleeping beauty, and let's see who is the prince that will come and awaken it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adina. It's interesting, the idea that the position that Yiddish is in, and I can't speak for Ladino, but there's a decline, and it's the result of a number of factors. This continued ripple effect from the Holocaust, which you mentioned, as well as assimilation and acculturation. There's also the second largest Jewish community in the world, here in America, is largely monolingual and doesn't have much interest in learning second languages. There's also the factor that Hebrew has become the primary Jewish vernacular, and that is that's an issue that I think will be continually difficult to overcome. I'm wondering how you see the nature of Yiddish language learning and planning within the shadow of Hebrew as a primary Jewish language. I mean, it's a question for all of you.
So you want to take it first?
When I was younger, the shlichim were going into South America, taking over the day schools. And there were shlichim in the youth, there were youth movements then. Now we don't even have youth movements, Zionist youth movements all over America. Sure, we were sure that everybody, all these teenagers would be speaking Hebrew. Now, people aren't speaking Yiddish, they're not speaking Hebrew, and there's a reason for it. So I don't want to go there yet. The same kinds of things that we see today, little nests, little germinations of people interested in language and culture are occurring within Israel. So I alluded to this, that Hebrew needs Yiddish, and Hebrew needs Judeo-Arabic, and Hebrew in Israel needs, and so in a few years there'll be stronger movements there too. I think that the question of transmission of culture through schooling versus transmission of culture through the home is a big issue. And I, for example, don't avec machen mit der Hand. I don't say those Hasidim, they don't read Shalom Aleichem. They will reach Shalom Aleichem, don't worry. We've depended on renegades from traditional Jewish life for centuries, and they're going to come and they're going to become Yiddish standardizers and Judeo-Spanish students too. I think we ourselves have to, we're contemporary people, we have to re-educate ourselves. I was raised on Yiddish literature, that was my whole education. But I was also raised with the walking and the talking grandparents, and we have to put them together. I think that there was one person I didn't mention who is a historian. Some of you know him. He was an archivist at YIVO, and he was an archivist at the Leo Baeck Institute. Stephen Lowenstein, Shlomo Levenstein, and a teacher in the summer program, and he wrote a textbook, I don't know if you use it at all, called The Jewish Cultural Tapestry, and I turned that textbook into a course. And he talks about the big tradition and the little tradition. So we're used to the fact that, when when I went to school, we used to say in Yiddish, Punkt wie der Teure hat abgehit. Punkt für die Jiden haben abgehit der Teure. This is Achad Ha'am saying, Azoi hat der Teure abgehit die Ganzkeit von der jüdische Volk. That we are used to the big Torah, the big tradition, and we haven't given too much attention to the little tradition. Well, analyzing history, it's the little tradition that kept Jews going. It was the ability to be able to make a home for yourself. Now, it might have been a hostile environment. However, there was a lot of reproduction, and there was a lot of transmission of good genes and bad genes and culture under these conditions because of these little traditions. And I think what you're alluding to and the models from the Middle Ages is somehow or other to appreciate and value those little traditions which are Yiddish, and our recipes and our songs and our customs and our ways of saying Kiddush. The localized Jewishness that we have to put back into the picture. Day school education ignores it entirely. There's only room for the big tradition. But certainly, because we have complex inheritance and heritages in Israel and here, I see very little difference. I mean, except that you have to go to the army and there's a constant threat, and it's certainly a different kind of society. But Israel's a diverse Jewish community too. We would hope that that little tradition, I think, could be cultivated within the family, because the reason Borchov and Birnbaum were able to become such leaders was because of those first 18 months of life, when they were listening to the Yiddish, when they were smelling the Yiddish. They weren't coming from nothing. What's important, I think, is to bring the culture into the family.
You know, Rachmiel and me work together quite often in certain things, but he is the optimist, and I'm the pessimist. I think that the political issues you alluded to between Hebrew and Yiddish, between changes in societies and so on and so forth, also point towards the fact that we have a different type of leadership in all communities all over. And it's a leadership that doesn't always understand the breadth of our culture and what they are defending or standing for. And I come from a world where Yiddish and Hebrew were not fighting necessarily to destroy one or the other, but were recognized as two nostrils, as we have that old saying from Sholem Aleichem, two nostrils to be able to breathe into our own culture. Now, let me give you an example from Mexico, because not that you're interested in it, but it's less controversial rather than speaking on issues here politically, which always is controversial. But in Mexico, for instance, there were Jewish schools with dual curricula, daily schools, and lo and behold, appears a leadership, people our age, that work in Va'ad HaChinuch of the community, in the Va'ad HaChinuch of the schools, and they say, you know what? With Hebrew alone is sufficient. And nobody peeps. And within a couple of years, there is no more Yiddish teachers in schools that had 50, 60, 70 years of a different type of curriculum. And suddenly, some people say, oh, it's a shame, my Bobe used to say A or B, and that's it. That's all there is. Nobody did anything for it. And this leadership didn't even understand what they're proposing, because as you suggested, the children today don't speak Hebrew any better than they did at the time. And now they've lost half of what they needed to know, plus. When we did EPIC here and we had to enter a school, we chose the better schools that we wanted them to work with the material. Invariably, every single school we visited, we had to say we are proposing X, Y, or Z. The school system, meaning the top echelon, the director and the teachers that were invited to talk to us on the first meeting, the response was, but we do it. We have done it. We've always been doing it. Nicht gesteugen und nicht geflogen. But the self-definition of perfection, the self-congratulatory definition of we are covering everything there is to cover about culture is there. So until we don't recognize what it is that we are losing and that we have lost, we have nothing to talk about.
I want to say, I mean, one of the things you mentioned about the antipathy among Americans to speak any other language, is one of the deepest problems here. And the universalization of English as a language, or in the Jewish context, if you speak Hebrew, you can get by. You can show up in Paris, you can show up in a Jewish community somewhere else, and you can be understood in a way that used to be that way, at least outside of the Mediterranean, with Yiddish, right? And that is one of the most difficult things. And what people don't understand, sadly, is that more languages create more languages. And exactly like you said, if you have Hebrew at a high level and you have Yiddish at a high level, other languages will come and proficiency will come because you're going to see all these connections. And it's a very deep tragedy. But it's what I don't, coming at this again as an outsider here to some extent, there are larger structures that I don't know how you peel back. I don't know how you fight against that general trend towards just difficulty with even imagining. When people speak a different language to their children than the general, when friends of mine who speak Yiddish to their kids, or I speak Spanish to my children, and everyone says, wow, how are they going to ever learn English? They're going to learn English like everyone learns English, right? They're going to learn just like our grandparents or great-grandparents learned 7 languages without ever going to school because that was life, and they had to, and they moved, and they changed. And it's a very deep problem, and it's definitely a tragedy. And the question is, how do you restart that? And how do you go there? And often for us, for most people who didn't grow up hearing Yiddish or a Mama Lashon in that sense, you go back through the books, you go back through the music. Depends on what there is. I mean, there's revival. One of the very most powerful areas of revival in these languages happens to be through the music, through the literature, through the history, and that's certainly an avenue that has to be deepened. But then again, we're dealing with minority who will then take that extra step and really master those languages and go back to their roots. But I agree with Rachmiel. In Israel, there is a lot of interest in people trying to recover the languages of their parents or grandparents that were really systematically robbed of the next generation in the name of creating a unified culture. I saw just a few months ago an amazing musician, Ravid Kahlani, whose father's from Yemen, and he has this group, Yemen Blues, and he writes songs in Hebrew and has his father help him to translate them into Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, Yemenite Judeo-Arabic. And he's not alone. There's many people trying to do this, but again, it's they're fighting upstream, but luckily there's an audience for this, so yesh tikva.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key ways to integrate these languages into the lives of average people through music. It's the little things that Rachmiel, that allow people to enter these things. The music is one way, food is another. People want to reclaim all kinds of old family recipes, and those are very often very much distinct, unique kinds of ethnic matters. But language, as we've said, the sort of monolingualism and the sort of move toward English internationally makes it extremely difficult. So I just want to pose one more question. Is it possible to have Jewish culture in a non-Jewish language? Is that a possibility?
So I'll just briefly say I think anything's possible. It's scary, some of the things that are possible. The poorer culture, smaller culture, little c, the way that I propose to teach it is not through the music or the books and so forth, but through the people always. And I've, for years now, done what I call intergenerational ethnic education. I bring into my classes, and I bring my classes into institutions, not just older people, but, you have a 5-year-old teaching an 80-year-old together with a 20-year-old. We have like 3-tiered classrooms. And I spoke to Joe Levy before last week. I saw this room full of Russian Jews right here. It took up the whole room. Those people have a lot to teach. And if you remember when Eddie and I studied together in Columbia, we used to go to Brighton Beach. And we went to what was then, I don't know if it's still there, the Shorefront Y. And we studied the interaction between the new Russians and the old Russians, which was quite something. The ones who would come in recent decades were the ones who would come in 1920. But the students, you learn a lot just because I think it's, if possible, it's with people. And a lot of that transmission can't occur in the family anymore. So I would think that would be a stronger culture.
I think the answer to your question is, of course, it exists, right? But the question is, what kind of culture exists? We have it here. We have it, and it's being transforming in front of us constantly. We don't know how it will look in 100 years or less. But yes, the question is, though, are we willing to give away the key of access to the 1,000-year production of our culture if we don't teach the languages that can open up those texts for us? Are we going to use an infinitesimal translated set of books that represent our culture? Are we willing to do that? I, on principle, am not.
I think, languages become Jewish, and yet you need to go back to the classics. I'm a big believer in classics and classic literature, and trying to reclaim the voices of the past. At the same time, Jews throughout the world have spoken multiplicity of languages and have respected their languages, but also have adapted to new ones. So we'll see what's going to happen. I don't know. We'll see what this. As much as I mourn over this infinite loss of languages and voices that, with time, with history, with persecutions, with displacements, with assimilation, are lost. At the same time, we don't know what's going to be next. So we'll see.
Shall we open it up to the audience for questions? Leia's walking around with a microphone. She'll come to you if you raise your hand.
I think we only have, because the discussion was fascinating and we went a little over, we really only have time for about 2 audience questions. So make them good.
Thank you, Hashanim Dank. I just want to say a few things. First of all, Adina, I feel your pain. We all feel your pain. I prefer to be on the side of the optimists, not the pessimists. And I just want to speak to how a language continues. A language continues with words. When Weinach's dictionary came out in 1968, it was a miracle. It was a rozhinke. Noch ein Churben, sofkelsof, a nai modern English-Yiddish Wörterbuch. When you look at that dictionary today, the only term for technology is the word computer. And of course, the Yiddish equivalent is der Computer. That was 1968. And one of the things that I hear over and over again from Yiddish students who are learning Yiddish now, is, how do you say this? How do you say that? We don't have the word for that. It's such a poor, So I just want to say that there is going to be a new dictionary coming out, Mirza Shem, within the next year. It will be more than 3 times the size of Weinach's English-Yiddish dictionary. It will be based on the work of Mordechai Schechter, all of the terminologies that he accumulated and he researched and he cataloged in 87 different card catalogs and shoeboxes. And this will be published by the Yiddish Liga in conjunction with a major academic publisher, which I am not at liberty to say, but it is in legal process at this point. And I just want to say that regardless of all the other cultural elements, yes, there's Jewish food, yes, there's Jewish music and klezmer music and all the wonderful things that surround Yiddish, but at a very elemental level, we're talking words, we're talking ways to communicate, and I think this dictionary will go a very long way to help us in that goal. Hashem Dank.
That's excellent to hear. I just want to add that the notion that Yiddish is a poor language has been going on for 150, 200 years. So it's really nothing new.
There's a gentleman who raised his hand over here.
I have a question. You have Sholem Aleichem, you have Balsheva Singer, Yiddish writers. Does anyone read them in Yiddish or only in English? And the foreword is totally in English. There's no Yiddish in it. So where would you get Yiddish?
No, there's a Yiddish forward.
It is?
Sure.
It's bigger than the English one.
Oh, because the one I get
Much
is...
bigger.
It exists, yeah.
I didn't realize that. Because
Yeah, it's a separate
We'll
edition.
after.
Thank you.
Okay, my point was that finding Yiddish, or how many people get exposed to Yiddish, because they can get everything in English, like what I said, Sholem Aleichem and Balsheva Singer, they've been translated. Does anyone read them in Yiddish?
Well, that's the point. It's not everything. They can get Takesh Shalom Aleichem and whatever you mentioned, but it's not everything, and that's the issue.
There's much more.
Hi, I'm sorry to take up a little bit more time, but I really don't want this opportunity to pass without saying something about what I think a response to this situation on the part of the YIVO Institute can be. And I concur completely, Adina, with what you were saying, but I don't think the problem is only that of language. My own observation coming as sort of an outsider into this world is that it's not just the language that is in danger. What is in danger is that the accomplishments of East European Jewish civilization of 1,000 years have been occluded, have been erased from the public record, so that students today, when they read books about modern art, about modern music, about psychology, about philosophy, they are never introduced to the actual accomplishments of our people and of our culture. Across the board, if you look at Wikipedia, this is an example that I use often, for Sigmund Freud, you find out that he was a Viennese physiologist. And you have to read much deeper down into the article to discover that he was of Jewish origin, but that he was of East European Jewish origin. His parents were Galician Jews who spoke Yiddish is something that is not revealed. The same is true with the philosopher Husserl. The same is true with the great avant-garde artistic movement of Dadaism, which was almost 80% Jewish and is considered one of the great artistic movements of the 20th century. And these things are simply not talked about, they're not read about, people don't know what East European Jewish life produced. This is a failure of our academies, often Jewish academics who write books on these subjects don't know these things. It's a question of knowledge, it's a question of dissemination. And there is something that can be done to fight back, it seems to me, because all of it is part and parcel of then the degradation of the understanding of the language that was at the foundation for so much of this accomplishment. And what can be done is precisely to produce more grammars, to produce dictionaries, but also produce works of scholarship in which these facts are revealed. I know for a fact that the research being done in the YIVO archives today is groundbreaking in so many areas that I thought should have been discovered 80 years ago, or 100 years, or should have been common knowledge, but were not common knowledge. And so the YIVO Institute, and part of, I think, what is also necessary is the digitization of these archival documents, the digitization of our books. This gentleman raised the issue of the fact that Sholem Aleichem has been translated into English, but the translation of Yiddish literature into English will only stimulate the desire to read it in the original if it is done well. But there is a low level of translation for the most part. And too often, the standards, and this comes back to standards, a great translator needs to have standards. And too often, those standards are lacking. And so we have to become a teaching institution. If we wish to fight this, and the YIVO Institute is one of the few institutions in the world that is capable of doing this. It has some resources. It doesn't have infinite resources. But I think that is part of our job. And it seems to me that it is not necessarily completely irreversible. The more young scholars that you can introduce, the more teenagers who go off to Wesleyan or Yale or Columbia or Princeton or Harvard, but know what their great-grandparents had done, what their grandparents had done, how they did it, will help to stimulate, I think, if not a renewal, at least some desire not to lose this extraordinary possession, our inheritance. So that's really all I wanted to get off my chest.
Okay. No. Yeah. Can I just comment a little bit? Just 1 second, please. I think that I agree completely with what you've said, but one could add that there is the possibility of facing a couple of philosophical, pedagogical routes on what needs to be done to reverse the trend that we have now. The one that you've mentioned, of course, have nothing against it, it sounds wonderful, but I would suggest that we need something that is part of the healthy, quote unquote, renewal of culture, which is to look a little bit to the younger people that need to get touched with our culture early on, not because we will make from every one of them a scholar into the future, but because only then we leave seeds into that generation for interest when they get to college and when they can touch what you are offering. Our effort then with EPIC at the time was precisely that, to create a future generation of interested people that will come to us already with vested interest to look and study and develop. I think that the fact that we don't have children as a generation being reproduced with our culture at home, because the homes have given away the responsibility to do that to schools, and the schools don't do it, at least half of it they are not touching, the whole Yiddish segment is gone, as well as the whole 1,000-year history of what that represents, then I think maybe, and I'm suggesting that the YIVO needs to look further into partnerships and other ways of dealing with the responsibility of creating another generation of interest. Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all the questions we have time for tonight. Thank you all for coming, and please help us continue this conversation at our next program on February 23rd, and pick up a brochure on your way out if you haven't already. Thank you.